Mark had always had a keen sense of adventure, which often led him to take spontaneous road trips to unknown destinations. One gloomy October evening, feeling the itch for a spontaneous journey, he grabbed his keys, a flashlight, and his iPhone. On a whim, he decided to let Apple Maps dictate his journey. "Take me somewhere interesting," he muttered half-jokingly as he opened the app and tapped on a suggested remote location that popped up, titled Scenic Route to Old Mill Town. As he followed the directions, the sky grew darker, and thick fog began to blanket the landscape. The road twisted through dense forests and overgrown fields, the shadows growing deeper and more ominous with each passing mile. Mark's excitement mingled with a hint of unease as the paved road turned to gravel, and the familiar signs of civilization faded away, replaced by crooked trees and an oppressive silence. An hour into the drive, the GPS directed him down a narrow, overgrown path that hardly looked drivable. Mark hesitated, his rational mind telling him to turn back. But the law of the unknown pushed him forward, his car's headlights cutting a swathe through the thick darkness. As he drove, the atmosphere grew heavier, and Mark noticed that his phone signal had disappeared. "Great," he muttered, his voice sounding alien in the silence. He glanced at his phone, but the GPS was still working, a solitary blue dot moving through an expanse of grey. Suddenly, the trees cleared, and he came upon a dilapidated sign reading "Welcome to Old Mill Town." The town was nothing more than a collection of crumbling buildings and abandoned streets, their decrepitude suggesting they had been forsaken many years ago. A chill ran down Mark's spine as he slowly drove through the town, the beams of his headlights briefly illuminating broken windows and shadows that seemed to flinch away from the light. Parking his car near what looked like the remains of an old town square, Mark grabbed his flashlight and decided to explore on foot. As he walked, the silence was broken only by the crunch of gravel under his shoes and the occasional distant howl of wind. Each building he passed seemed to watch him, their empty windows like dark, unblinking eyes. Mark's flashlight flickered as he approached an old mill at the edge of the town, its towering silhouette looming ominously against the night sky. The door was ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Compelled by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Mark pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air inside was musty, filled with the scent of mold and decay. His flashlight beam danced across old machinery covered in cobwebs, the floor littered with debris. As he ventured deeper, he thought he heard a soft whispering sound, like voices murmuring from the shadows. Shining his light towards the sound, he found nothing but the empty air and the old, rusted equipment. He didn't look back as he ran from the mill, sprinting towards his car. He fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking violently. As he started the engine and put the car in reverse, he glanced back at the mill. The figure was there again, watching him from a broken window, its presence a palpable weight in the foggy night air. Mark drove away from Old Mill Town as fast as his car would allow, the winding roads a blur as he raced back towards the familiarity of streetlights and cellular reception. The eerie silence of the abandoned town gave way to the normal sounds of the night, crickets chirping and the distant hum of highway traffic. Yet, the terror of what he had experienced clung to him, a cold shroud that no sense of returning normality could dispel. Driving recklessly, Mark didn't stop until he reached the brightly lit service station many miles away from Old Mill Town. He pulled over, his breaths quick and shallow, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he tried to comprehend the night's events. He replayed the encounter over and over in his mind, each time feeling the same icy fear as when the shadowy figure had approached him in the mill. Inside the convenience store of the service station, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Mark attempted to calm himself with a hot coffee. As he sipped, he noticed his phone had regained service. The screen lit up with missed calls and messages, but Mark ignored them. Instead, he opened his map app, half expecting it not to display his recent treacherous route. However, there it was, his entire journey laid out, including the final destination at Old Mill Town. The map even tagged his current location with a bright blue dot, an eerie reminder that whatever technology had led him to that forsaken place was still with him, still functioning. Determined to understand why Apple Maps had directed him to such a place, Mark tapped on the screen, zooming in on Old Mill Town. To his surprise, the map updated suddenly, and the road to Old Mill Town vanished, replaced by a message that read, "Route unavailable." Chills ran down his spine. Was it a glitch, or had something altered his route intentionally? Unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched, Mark looked around nervously. The other few patrons of the service station were absorbed in their own late-night travels, oblivious to the fear gripping him. Feeling exposed, he decided to leave, his coffee half finished. As he got back on the road, the sense of being followed persisted. In his rearview mirror, shadows seemed to flicker and shift, and every time he passed a dark stretch of road, he felt a surge of panic. When he finally reached home, the safety of his apartment felt like a sanctuary. However, sleep eluded him. Every shadow in the corner of his room suggested the presence of the shadowy figure from the mill. The whispers he thought he'd left behind in Old Mill Town seemed to find him even here, in the supposed safety of his home. Mark lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the journey had somehow followed him back. The next day, out of desperation and fear, Mark decided to research Old Mill Town. His searches led him to obscure forums and old newspaper archives detailing various legends and real tragedies associated with the town. Each story seemed to weave a complex tapestry of sorrow, loss, and unexplained phenomena, stories of people who ventured into the town and were never seen again, tales of ghostly apparitions, and chilling accounts of past residents who spoke of a curse. Mark's obsession grew as he dug deeper, each piece of information only serving to heighten the dread building within him. He knew he couldn't ignore what he'd experienced, he needed answers. Compelled by a mix of fear and necessity, he decided to return to Old Mill Town. He had to know if the apparition was real or if his mind, driven by isolation and the eerie ambience of the town, had conjured it. Packing his camera, a digital voice recorder, and several other pieces of amateur ghost hunting equipment, Mark set out once again as dusk began to settle. The familiar road stretched before him, each mile bringing him closer to the dark heart of Old Mill Town, and potentially, closer to understanding the nightmare that had taken hold of his life. As he approached the outskirts of the abandoned town, the sun dipped below the horizon, and the encroaching darkness seemed to swallow the road ahead. The air grew colder as he drove into the town, the familiar sense of dread wrapping around him like a thick fog. What awaited him in the shadows of Old Mill Town was unknown, but Mark felt driven by a force beyond his own rational understanding, compelled to face whatever darkness lingered in that forgotten place. As Mark's car rolled into the desolate streets of Old Mill Town, the headlights cut through the darkness, casting long, sinister shadows across the crumbling facades of the buildings. A palpable silence enveloped the area, the kind of silence that presses against the ears, heavy and ominous. Mark parked near the same spot as before, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind racing with every possible outcome of his return. Stepping out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot seemed unusually loud in the absolute stillness of the night. Mark's flashlight pierced the darkness, its beam trembling slightly as his nerves threatened to betray him. He walked towards the old mill, the site of his last encounter, his equipment bag slung over his shoulder, each step taking him deeper into the heart of his fears. As he approached the mill, the air grew inexplicably colder, his breath visible in the chilly night air. Mark paused, listening. The whispering started again, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, then growing louder, more urgent. It was as if the voices of the town's long-gone inhabitants were carried on the wind, each one telling their sorrowful tale. Mark entered the mill cautiously, his flashlight scanning the dark corners of the vast room. The old machinery loomed like the skeletons of ancient beasts, their metal bones casting eerie shadows on the walls. Setting up his equipment quickly, Mark prepared to record any electronic voice phenomena and measure any electromagnetic field changes, hoping to capture proof of the supernatural occurrences he'd witnessed. No sooner had he turned on his equipment than a chill wind swept through the mill, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into darkness. The sudden blackness was complete, oppressive. Mark fumbled for his lighter, his hands shaking. When the small flame finally sparked to life, it revealed that he was not alone. Figures stood all around him, barely discernible in the dim light of the flame. They were silent, still, their eyes empty voids that seemed to stare right through him. Mark's heart raced as panic surged within him. He tried to speak, to ask them who they were, what they wanted, but the words caught in his throat. Then the figures began to move towards him, slow and deliberate. The air filled with a cacophony of whispers, each voice overlapping the next until it became a dissonant chorus of despair. Mark backed away, his mind reeling with terror, as the spectral forms reached out to him, their hands cold and insubstantial. In a desperate bid for escape, Mark dropped the lighter and turned to run, but he tripped over a piece of fallen debris, crashing to the ground. The camera around his neck snapped pictures automatically, the flash illuminating the room in brief, stark bursts. Each flash captured the haunting faces of the figures, their expressions twisted in anguish and rage. Scrambling to his feet, Mark raced out of the mill, not daring to look back. He could feel them behind him, hear their whispers in his ears, feel their cold presence just inches away. He made it to his car, threw himself inside, and locked the doors. Panting, sweating, he started the engine and drove away as fast as he could, the mill and its ghostly inhabitants receding into the night. As Mark drove, the whispering slowly faded, but the fear that clutched his heart did not. He knew now that Old Mill Town was more than just a place of historical tragedy. It was a nexus of unresolved spirits, a place of profound sorrow and malevolent hauntings. He couldn't just leave them there, trapped in their endless night of despair. Determined, Mark knew what he had to do. He needed to come back, not alone this time, but with a team, with anyone who would believe him and help him free the spirits of Old Mill Town. As he made his way back to civilization, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, a symbol of hope and a new beginning. The road ahead was daunting, and the challenge immense, but Mark felt a resolve settle over him. The town spirits had reached out to him, not to frighten or harm, but to seek release from their eternal torment. He would help them, no matter what it took. The journey back to Old Mill Town was just beginning, and Mark was ready to face whatever darkness lay waiting. After his harrowing experience, Mark spent the following weeks organizing a return to Old Mill Town. He reached out to various experts in the field of paranormal activity, explaining his encounters and showcasing the evidence he had collected. Many dismissed his claims as fabrications or the misinterpretations of natural phenomena, but a select few showed genuine interest and agreed to join him in his quest to uncover the mysteries of the town and aid the restless spirits. Among these were Dr. Helena Farrow, a psychologist who specialized in paranormal psychology, and Jacob Wells, a seasoned ghost hunter known for his appearances on various supernatural investigation TV shows. Both brought a wealth of experience and their own equipment, enhancing the capabilities of the team. Together with Mark, they formed a plan to conduct a series of overnight investigations throughout Old Mill Town, starting with the old mill where Mark had his most intense encounter. They prepared meticulously, gathering state-of-the-art technology to capture audio, video, and electromagnetic anomalies. They also brought items they believed could trigger spiritual activity, such as objects from the era most of the town's residents had lived in. As the sun rose over Old Mill Town, casting light on its forgotten streets and buildings, Mark looked out over the landscape, a mix of dread and determination settling in his heart. They had made contact, opened a door that perhaps had been closed for too long, and now they must see it through, no matter what darkness they would face in the nights to come. As the investigation deepened, the team organized a systematic exploration of the entire town. Each building, each shadowed corner and decrepit alley held layers of history, layers of voices that had been silenced too long. Night after night, they documented anomalies, whispers, apparitions, movements that no living person made. It was as if the very essence of Old Mill Town was gradually awakening, responding to their presence with a crescendo of paranormal activity. The climax of their investigation centered around the old church at the heart of the town, a place that all previous explorations had strangely avoided, perhaps unconsciously. It was Dr. Farrow who suggested they focus their efforts there. Churches are often emotional focal points, she explained. They might provide a nexus for whatever energies are at play here. The structure was in dire condition, with ivy climbing up its stone walls, stained glass windows shattered and gaping like open wounds. As they set up their equipment inside the nave, the air felt thick, charged with a palpable tension. Mark noticed that even the usually stoic Jacob seemed uneasy, his cameras shaking slightly in his hands. They began their vigil as midnight approached, the moon casting eerie, shifting patterns through the broken windows. The church was silent at first, the only sound the soft whir of their equipment and the distant roar of the sea. But as the minutes ticked by, a soft humming filled the air, a tune melancholic and haunting, a hymn, it seemed, from many decades past. Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, their breath misting in the cold air, and the humming grew louder, more insistent. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of their vision, coalescing into forms that were almost human, almost tangible. "We are here," a chorus of voices whispered, the words echoing off the stone walls. "We are the forgotten, the lost." Dr. Farrow spoke into the thickening darkness. "We hear you," she said firmly. "Tell us what you need to find peace." A silence fell, heavy and expectant. Then, all at once, the church filled with light, not the soft glow of their equipment, but a brilliant, blinding light that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. In this light, figures appeared, dozens of them, dressed in the faded garb of another era, their faces marked by sorrow but also by hope. "We were lost," they said, their voices melding into one. "Trapped by tragedy, by unspoken secrets. We need to be remembered, to be known." The team worked through the night, recording everything, listening to the stories of these spirits. They learned of a devastating fire that had claimed many lives, a tragedy that had been covered up, forgotten by the world outside. It was this collective trauma, this buried grief, that had held the spirits to this place. As dawn approached, they held a ceremony right there in the church, a ceremony of remembrance and release. They spoke the names of the dead, acknowledged their lives, their deaths, and their suffering. And as they did, the light grew warmer, the shadows receding, the air gradually lightening. When the sun rose, streaming through the broken windows, the church was calm, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The figures that had appeared in the light were gone, hopefully moved onto whatever peace they had been denied in life. The team packed up their equipment, each member quiet, reflective. They had come seeking ghosts, but had found so much more, a hidden chapter of history, a tragedy that had longed for recognition. As they left Old Mill Town, the sun high in the sky, Mark looked back at the church, its structure still a silhouette against the morning light. It no longer seemed menacing, but rather peaceful, a sentinel watching over a town that was finally, hopefully, at rest. The drive back was silent, each member of the team lost in thought. They had come to Old Mill Town as investigators, as scientists, but they left as witnesses, as keepers of the town's sad history. Mark knew that their experiences here would stay with them forever, a poignant reminder of the power of memory, of the need for stories to be told, for truths to be acknowledged. And while they had achieved what they came for, Mark felt a deep certainty that Old Mill Town would never be completely silent. There would always be stories, whispers carried on the wind, a reminder that the past, no matter how hidden, never truly dies. The ride back from Old Milltown was a mixture of relief and reflection. The team felt a sense of accomplishment, but the haunting beauty of the spirit stories lingered in their minds. Mark, especially, couldn't shake the images of the faces he had seen, the voices he had heard. Despite their success, a nagging feeling told him that something was left unfinished. Back in their base, the team reviewed the extensive footage and audio recordings. The evidence was clear and overwhelming: shadows that moved independently, disembodied voices, and most strikingly, the brilliant light that had filled the church. They prepared their findings for a documentary that would tell the story of Old Milltown and the spirits they had encountered. As they delved deeper into the recordings, a troubling pattern emerged. There was a name that kept appearing in the EVPs and the whispers: Samuel. Unlike the other spirits, Samuel seemed angry, his presence darker and more oppressive. He hadn't shown himself during their ceremony, and Mark realized they hadn't heard his story. Haunted by this omission, Mark knew he had to return one last time. The rest of the team hesitated, weary from their ordeal, but ultimately they agreed. They couldn't leave without knowing the full truth, without giving Samuel the same peace they had offered the others. They arrived in Old Milltown as dusk fell, the sky bruised with the colors of twilight. The town seemed quieter than before, almost expectant. The group made their way back to the church, where they had first encountered the spirits. As they entered, the temperature dropped sharply, and the air felt thick with tension. Mark set up a single camera and a digital recorder at the center of the nave. "Samuel," he called out, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "We know you're here. We want to hear your story. Please, tell us how we can help you find peace." The response was immediate. The candles they had lit flickered violently before being snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. The EMF meter spiked, and the air filled with a low, guttural growl. The team huddled together, their flashlights casting jittery beams into the blackness. "Why did you come back?" A voice boomed through the darkness, filled with anger and pain. "You freed them, but you cannot free me." "Tell us why, Samuel," Mark pleaded, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "What happened to you?" A cold wind whipped through the church, and the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Betrayal. Murder. I was wronged. They left me to die." Images flashed in Mark's mind, scenes of violence and desperation. He saw a man, bound and beaten, left alone in the depths of the mill. Samuel had been wronged by the very people they had helped, his anger and pain binding him to this place in a way that was far more potent and dangerous. "Samuel, we can help you," Mark said, his voice breaking. "Tell us what you need." The temperature dropped further, and the shadows seemed to close in around them. "I need justice," the voice hissed. "I need retribution." Dr. Farrow stepped forward, her voice calm and authoritative. "Samuel, we can acknowledge your suffering. We can make sure your story is told, that the world knows the truth. But you must let go of your anger." There was a long, agonizing silence. Then, the air seemed to vibrate with energy, and a figure materialized before them, a man, his face twisted in anguish, his body bearing the marks of his torment. "They must pay," Samuel growled, his eyes burning with hatred. "I cannot rest until they pay." Mark felt a deep sadness for the tortured spirit. "Samuel, those who wronged you are long gone. We can't change the past, but we can honor your memory and ensure your story is never forgotten." The figure wavered, as if struggling with the weight of his own rage and sorrow. The energy in the room grew more intense, the very walls seeming to pulse with Samuel's anger. The team braced themselves, unsure of what would come next. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a deafening roar filled the air. The figure of Samuel began to dissolve, his form breaking apart like mist in the wind. The team clung to each other as the tremors grew stronger, the church seeming to buckle under the weight of the spiritual conflict. Just as it seemed the building would collapse, the shaking stopped. The air grew still, and a profound silence fell over the church. The figure of Samuel was gone, his presence dissipated into the ether. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by a calm, almost sacred peace. The team slowly gathered their equipment, the gravity of what they had witnessed settling over them. They knew they had done all they could. Samuel's anger and pain had been acknowledged, his story told. Whether he had found peace or simply moved onto another plane, they could not say. As they left the church, the first light of dawn began to break over Old Mill Town. The buildings, once menacing and foreboding, now seemed to bask in the soft morning glow. Mark looked back one last time, feeling a sense of closure and hope. The drive back was silent, each team member lost in their thoughts. They had faced the darkness and come through it, changed but whole. Old Mill Town had shared its secrets, and they had listened. Back home, they compiled their findings into a comprehensive documentary, ensuring that the stories of Old Mill Town would be remembered, that the spirits they had encountered would not be forgotten. The documentary garnered attention, sparking discussions about the paranormal and the power of unresolved history. Mark knew that while their work in Old Mill Town was complete, the echoes of its past would always be with him. The spirits had touched his life in a way that was both terrifying and profound, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. In the quiet moments, he could still hear the whispers, feel the chill of the mill, see the faces of those who had sought peace. And he knew that somewhere, in the depths of forgotten places,